So where are you going to what's the original?
Yeah, like it was until
All right, everybody.
Oh yeah, stay
Because
on.
otherwise it's go like
Okay, are you ready?
Oh, well, Laura's, no, it'd be more expensive.
All right, everyone.
Besides,
Our last panel for today is about LGBTQ plus Appalachians. LGBTQ plus Americans have been constructed by mainstream U.S. culture as predominantly white, wealthy, highly educated, childless urban dwellers largely preoccupied with shopping, couture, gourmet food, and vacations. Images of LGBTQ plus folks that dominate media programming, including characters in Modern Family, Transparent, and the rebooted Will and Grace, largely reinforce these typologies or stereotypes. However, these portrayals do not reflect the experience of the majority of LGBTQ plus Appalachians. This interdisciplinary panel will discuss the issues and challenges faced by Appalachian LGBTQ plus youth, the role that masculinity plays in the perception of gender nonconforming people living in Appalachia, the treatment access issues and social stigma that have operated to place Appalachian LGBTQ plus communities at greater risk for opioid abuse, and the discrimination Appalachian LGBTQ plus individuals face in the criminal justice system. And I'll turn it over to Professor Jennifer Oliva.
Thanks everybody for coming. We have a wonderful panel today. I'm the moderator, so I have the easiest job, and what I'm going to do is give a real brief introduction of each of the panelists, who will give about an 8 to 10 minute talk, and we're trying very hard to allow for questions at the end of the presentations. And a fascinating group of folks here. We're going to start out with Professor Todd Brower, who was brave enough to go first. He's the Judicial Education Director at the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. He's also a constitutional scholar at Western State College School of Law in California, and is also the director of their Institute for Global Law. Today he's going to talk to us about demographics of the LGBTQ community throughout the Appalachian region.
That's right.
Turn it over to Todd.
Okay, great. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to move over here, and that's simply because I want to be out of the way of my own slides. So let's see. Come on, let's go. There we go. So this is it. This is what you heard in the introduction, right? There's the couple from Modern Family, and it's important to know what the media images are so that we can correct them, right? So what I'm going to be talking about are data that exists taken from the Gallup Daily Tracking Poll. So everything on these slides are of that in the Appalachian region. Those are the counties that the Appalachian Regional Commission says constitute Appalachia, and all of the data comes from those counties. Generally speaking, right, in Appalachia, we have a big division between people 30 years and younger and above 30 years in terms of LGBT people. In general, the older cohort, so 30 years and older, are more like their non-LGBT peers than the younger group, which are who are substantially different, as it turns out. And we can see, I see the slide thing goes twice. We can see this in this kind of thing. So the way to read all these graphs that I'm going to show you, the blue are non-LGBT people, and LGBT people are either red or reddish, which is men, and goldish, etc., which is women. So that we can see that the two slides over here, and I'm missing a pointer, but it will be right there at the end. That's the older group, and you can see in terms of gender that they're approximately the same as non-LGBT people, but there's a huge disparity when we're talking about the younger cohort. And that's an interesting fact, right? So actually, I'm going to present the data, and if you have questions about, like, what does this data mean, what's it going to mean for me in my work and things of that nature, I'm happy to talk about those, but I want to make sure that we have time for everybody, so I'll be happy to take questions like that, but I'd like to present the data first. If we look at urbanicity, that is to say urban versus rural, the green is rural in this sense, and then the red and the yellow are, as we've already said. LGBT people in Appalachia are predominantly urban as opposed to rural. Men more so than women, and younger even more so than the older cohort. In general, Appalachia is predominantly white. That's true for LGBT people in Appalachia as well, although in general, LGBT people are more diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, and for that matter, mixed race heritage, than are non-LGBT people. So, what about marital status? So even after Obergefell, the same-sex marriage case for the Supreme Court, LGBT people are less likely to be married here in Appalachia than their non-LGBT peers, matched by age and gender cohorts. They're more likely to be single or partnered. That's especially true for the older cohort, 30 plus. And then the last bit is an interesting thing that's going to tie into the next slide. LGBT women are more likely to be separated and divorced and less likely to be widowed than non-LGBTQ people. Now, this is not, we know this from this data, but we also know that one of the things that's happening is that people who live, LGBTQ people, who live in the South, the Midwest, in traditionally conservative areas of the country, which would include Appalachia in general, tend to be, that community people marry earlier, often have children, and come out, if you're gay or lesbian, later in life. What that means, and we can see it in the women, right, that these are women who often have had a past, in this case, heterosexual relationships, and same-sex marriage has only been around for a couple of years. And then they're not living their entire life with that partner. They tend to get divorced and probably, in fact, end up, as we know, partnered or single, but as an out gay woman. So, all right. So what do we know? So then kids then match with that. Older LGBTQ women are more likely to have children under 18. That's less true for LGBTQ women who are younger because, of course, they come out earlier and may not have had the same social pressures to marry, have children, or to hide their sexuality. Men are less likely to have kids in both age groups, but older LGBT men are more likely to have those children, right? So this all matches with what we say. In terms of education, in general, there's not a tremendous amount of difference between LGBTQ people and non-LGBTQ people in Appalachia, except for younger LGBTQ women. They are less likely to have a college degree and more likely to only have a high school education. That's not true for men, it's not true for older women. It would become important if we were talking about the lunch speaker, and one of the factors that means that people are not participating in the workforce. This may be one of those groups. So religiosity, so at the end, the two at the end are LGBT, non-LGBT, and then the rest are our normal cohorts by age and sex. We can see that LGBT people are generally less religious than their non-LGBT counterparts. Older people are more religious than younger, and women are more religious than men. And that's true in the LGBTQ communities as well as generally speaking. Lifetime military service, LGBT people have less military service than non-LGBT people. In Appalachia, by the way, that's not a terribly significant, there isn't a huge population in Appalachia that have military service, period. But the LGBT community is less. Older men, you can see, considerably greater than anybody else. Older greater than younger, but lesbians more likely to have military service than non-lesbians, at both age cohorts, actually. Financial needs in general, this is a national trend. Appalachia is no different. LGBTQ people have lower incomes in general, fewer financial resources. That's true for LGBTQ women, particularly younger women. They are more likely to be below the federal poverty line. Men are poorer than their non-LGBTQ peers, although men in general and LGBT men are also wealthier, have greater resources. Wealthy is too strong a statement. Have greater financial resources than women, generally. Health and health outcomes. Older LGBTQ people are more likely to rate their health as poor than non-LGBTQ peers, more likely to have some form of chronic disease, and more likely to develop it earlier. And the last statistic is one that I would imagine lots of people in this room already know. that LGBTQ people report approximately double the rates of depression than their non-LGBTQ peers. Right? And that is particularly strong here in Appalachia. That's a greater disparity than I've seen in other things. So we'll talk more about it. If you're interested, we have on the Williams Institute website state-by-state reports judged from the census about LGBTQ people in various states. That's there on that thing. We'll talk later.
Professor Woods. Next we have Professor Jordan Woods. He's an assistant professor of law at the University of Arkansas and does some really fascinating scholarship on the connection between criminality and policing in minority communities. And he's today going to talk to us about the connections between religious exemption laws and the treatment of LGBTQ youth and children in the child welfare system. Mr. Woods.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm actually going to sit, and I want to thank first the students for all of your hard work and congratulating you on the symposium. I also want to thank Professor Beatty and Professor Oliva for the opportunity to speak, and thanking the symposium for including this topic, which is not really discussed given the region that we're in, and it's just a huge opportunity to shed light on these issues that don't get much treatment. And I realize that I only have 8 to 10 minutes to speak, and when you're on a panel and that's the only thing standing between the audience and happy hour, take that limit seriously. But I'm a criminologist by training, and my work draws on different criminological methods to draw light on legal issues in the criminal justice systems, in the family justice systems, and in particular the child welfare system. And today I'm talking about a paper that I'm working on about the recent proliferation of religious exemption laws that specifically include provisions that affect the treatment of LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system, which is really part of a broader project that I'm working on about the currently shifting legal terrain about the treatment of LGBT youth in the child welfare system across different states. So to frame the paper on religious exemptions and why it's especially exciting to talk about this at a conference on Appalachian justice, I thought it would be best to situate this shift or at least this move towards religious exemptions in the broader shifting legal terrain. So in the past decade or so, the terrain of state law, statutes, agency policies, and agency regulations involving the treatment of LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system has shifted quite dramatically. So about 20 states have passed anti-discrimination measures that offer LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system some form of anti-discrimination protection, and the strength of those range. Illinois just became the first state to pass a comprehensive policy that requires states to actually take affirmative steps to place LGBT youth in supportive environments. So they go a step further than anti-discrimination to require affirmative protection. And in the past 3 years, 7 states have gone the completely other direction and passed religious exemption laws that are specific to LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system. And generally speaking, these laws shield key actors in the child welfare system, including child welfare agencies, private faith-based religiously affiliated organizations, and current individual and prospective foster and adoptive parents from any adverse action as a result of raising a youth or a child in a way that's consistent with their sincerely held religious beliefs. And this push recently for religious exemption laws involving LGBTQ child welfare is especially pertinent to the issues involving LGBTQ youth in Appalachia because about half of the states that have passed these laws are in this region. So we're dealing with Virginia, we're dealing with the Mississippi, so the northern part of Mississippi that's affected, and then also Alabama, so the northern part of Alabama that affects this region. And to give you an idea of what these religious exemptions are about and what exactly the stakes are for LGBTQ youth, I thought it would be best just to give you an example from the region, which is HB 1523 from Mississippi. So now in effect, HB 1523, it's known as one of perhaps the broadest religious exemption law. It includes several religious exemptions in many domains, including marriage, employment, But it includes 3 particular provisions that are actually specific to child welfare services. So to begin, HB 1523, it prohibits state actors from taking adverse action against any religious organization that provides or declines to provide any foster care or adoption services that are consistent with its religious views. So what LGBT advocates warn is that child welfare providers can turn away LGBTQ youth who need support or help from the state, including those who have been kicked out of their families for being LGBTQ in the first place. HB 1523, it also prohibits state actors from taking adverse action against individual foster parents who guide, instruct, or raise a child consistent with their religious views. So as a result of this provision, LGBTQ youth could be forced to stay in homes that denounce their sexual orientation or gender identities. In addition, parents could force transgender youth in particular, but really all LGBTQ youth, to act or dress in ways or to express themselves that are inconsistent with their LGBTQ identities. And at the extreme, it opens opportunities for foster parents and adoptive parents to subject LGBTQ youth to damaging conversion therapies, of which 40 states still don't have measures on the books restricting those types of practices. And then finally, HB 1523, it prohibits the state from taking adverse action against any person who declines to participate in the provision of medical treatments, counseling, or surgery related to the gender affirmation process, which means that this increases possibilities for transgender and gender nonconforming youth in the child welfare system to be denied the medical services that they need during the gender affirmation process. And what's important about these provisions is that critically, states, including Mississippi, are contracting with private faith-based organizations to help fill gaps in inadequate child welfare services in the state. And many of these faith-based organizations openly denounce LGBTQ people. So we have this situation where we have greater reliance on faith-based organizations that are denouncing LGBTQ identity, and then legal protections that are offering protections to these forms or instances of religiously motivated discrimination. So although the stakes of religious exemptions are high for LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system, what I discuss in the paper is that these experiences of LGBTQ youth are largely overshadowed in the dominant conversations, both on the left and on the right, about religious exemptions. And what I'm arguing in the paper is that if we're truly committed to LGBTQ equality, then we need to wrap these issues about child welfare into the broader conversation about religious exemptions. And what I mean by that is that the current terms of this debate about religious liberty and LGBT equality, it's largely centered on LGBTQ adults, and in particular, same-sex couples who are married or wish to marry. So on one side, proponents of broad religious exemptions argue that taking a cake or baking a cake or taking photos at a wedding reception facilitates same-sex marriage in violation of their sincerely held religious beliefs. On the other side, the bulk of equality conversations argue that anti-discrimination protections that anti-discrimination protections are undermined or eroded that really are about protecting sexual orientation and gender identity equality more generally. And so what I show in the paper is that this narrow lens about marriage has actually shaped advocates' arguments for broad religious exemptions in the LGBTQ child welfare context. And so what they're arguing is that these religious exemptions in the LGBT child welfare context are actually pushed back post-Obergefell as responses to same-sex marriage. And what I show in the paper is that I challenge this narrow marriage frame, and to do so, I rely on historical theories of deviance in the field of criminology to show that religious exemptions involving LGBTQ child welfare do much more than mediate these conflicts between religious liberty and same-sex marriage. And what I do is I show through deviance theory that these exceptions are actually the latest point of a much longer historical trajectory of child welfare interventions into family life that rely on sexual deviance concepts to subordinate LGBTQ youth. And I talk about 3 concepts in particular. First, the role of the family in having a critical role in shaping sexual orientation and gender identity development, and therefore they're a site for intervention by the state. Second, that sexual orientation and gender identity development of youth are malleable and thus subject to change. And then third, that LGBTQ adults are threats to children and therefore not suitable adoptive or foster parents. And I don't have enough time here to discuss the trajectory in detail, but the key point that I'll stress here is that this alternative framing shows that religious exemptions are really a vehicle for enduring anxiety about sexual deviance concepts and attempts to shape and control the gender identities and sexual orientations of youth. And what's important about these religious exemptions is that they sustain and propagate sexual deviance concepts by substituting and equating the religious or moral views of key actors in the child welfare system with what's actually in the best interest of youth regarding their sexual orientation and gender identity development. And what I argue is that this agenda about sexual deviance, when it's explicitly framed in terms of sodomy reform or sodomy prohibitions and marriage restrictions, it's denounced. And in this building this historical trajectory, what I'm showing is that these broad religious exemptions are enabling these outdated sexual deviance concepts to thrive in the child welfare system in very hidden and very damaging ways. And why I say we have to really think about, since I realize my time is short, why it's especially important to think about the child welfare context is that this is already a system where LGBTQ youth are underserved and where they face disproportionate LGBTQ inequalities, and that these religious exemptions are only exacerbating these harms, and that these spillover effects occur not just within the child welfare system, but then threaten equality more broadly when folks either age out of the child welfare system or the inequalities that they suffer as youth then have long-term impacts in terms of their status as adults. So I stopped there because I promised it would be 10 minutes, and I leave the floor over for the next presenter.
Next, we have Professor Cris Mayo. She is the director of the LGBTQ Center here at WVU. She's also professor in women's and gender studies here at the university. Today, she'll be giving a talk about WVU schools and LGBTQ youth.
So, thank you. All 50 states have laws against bullying, and we think that that probably should protect LGBTQ students in schools. By the way, it's my life's mission to get us a different acronym, one that is actually pronounceable. Increasingly, LGBTQ students and employees are finding Title IX or Title VII related protection from discrimination. But we're running into difficulties as well. It's not only the fact of religious exemptions that are starting to push against this, but we have difficulties with the simple issue that in schools, which are regulated by policies and regulated by local state laws and regulated by things that are allowed to be worked out administratively in schools themselves, laws may set out an ethical ideal or even a procedural route, but without adequate training, advocacy, and resources, they aren't put into practice, or they wind up being a very interesting mare's nest of confusing sorts of things going on. So we've recently seen in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the decision not to protect students. In this case, it was the decision on the part of school administrators to be the source of hostility that led to a costly settlement. Ash Whitlock won $800,000 against administrators who would not respect his mother's, and his doctor's decision to have him socially transition to confirm his male identity. The practices in schools should have included the use of pronouns and the use of gender-appropriate restrooms. Ash was recognized by peers as a boy, and it was adults in school who chose to continue not to do so. Significantly, the growing use of Title IX and Title VII in such cases pushed the district to decide not to fund an appeal to the Supreme Court and instead chose to settle. The settlement, of course, is expectedly narrow. Like that reached by Gavin Grimm with his district, it only requires that the district recognize Ash and Ash's right to use the correct bathroom should he ever decide to return to school having graduated and gone on to Madison. It does not extend to any other trans person. And so we are in a situation where we have a state law that should have been in protection. We have increasing recognition of how Title IX or Title VII might have worked, not Title VII in this case, but might have worked. But we have a school that chooses to be intransigent. Fast forward to living in West Virginia.
Is that fast forward?
Yes, I did say fast forward. Thank you, Williams Institute, for everything I'm about to say.
Go ahead.
In West Virginia, a state that the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law characterizes as having the U.S.'s largest proportion of trans people aged 15 to 18, love to talk about the methodology. We lack state-level protections for trans youth and LGBTQ youth.
It's cold.
Yeah, just want to know. No, we lack, of course, non-discrimination protections. We live without hate crimes laws, including gender identity and sexual orientation. And while we have seen municipalities willing to add gender identity and sexual orientation to ordinances, navigating the patchwork of protections, especially if you're an LGBTQ youth, can be challenging. Hostilities remain widespread, and the Williams Institute also characterizes West Virginia as dead last in the quality of life for LGBTQ people. Perhaps not surprisingly, their research shows the number of trans people drops off in West Virginia after the age of 18. I don't want to make too much of this. One assumes that they perhaps go somewhere else. So the West Virginia state environment can be welcoming, but there are significant indications to young people that it is not. And there are indications that are given through the pedagogy of laws and through the pedagogy of how we determine to apply laws and policies. So while some educational institutions like WVU have chosen to keep Obama-era guidance on interpreting Title IX to protect trans students from discrimination, of course, our state attorney general does not. Apparently he is today barricaded behind a taxidermied black bear and not allowing any constituents in. I don't know if anybody's been keeping up with Instagram. It's high freaking hilarious, but sorry.
The bear didn't vote for him either.
Apparently not. You may recall recent incidents, including the deputy school bus driver in Clay County who, while in his deputy uniform and driving a district school bus, told a gay student, and here I'm sorry I am going to say a few words of invective, "No faggot activity will be permitted on this bus. In my Bible, it states that faggots will burn in hell, and I will not condone it." On the one hand, I think eventually he's probably going to be protected by religious sorts of exemptions because he's actually telling people what he thinks his Bible says. And on the other hand, I would say probably in those very short sentences, he was also stepping over the line. More locally, trans students have complained to parents that despite some lip service to inclusion in our local district, they are subject to harassment at their schools. Gay-straight alliances in this town have had their bulletin boards torn down, and some school personnel have shared that their Title IX officers don't know their responsibilities. They can't figure out whether to go with the state attorney general or whether to go with the kind of more capacious understanding of rights given in the municipality of Morgantown. And in some cases, I'm told by people who work in schools in counties around here, their Title IX officers don't even know that they are the Title IX officers. West Virginia's Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization won a grant to do training to help staff work with LGBTQ youth, and as a result, they lost $80,000 in donations and have had to end plans to extend their services to some rural West Virginia counties. So we have a very mixed bag here. According to GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Educators Network, LGBTQ students in rural schools experience higher levels of harassment and abuse. They experience higher levels of neglect from teachers than do suburban or urban students. And further, rural LGBTQ students report a much lower rate of inclusion of LGBTQ-related lessons in schools, unless you count the sort of lesson that the bus driver gave, which is not what we're counting. Rural students were half as likely to have a gay-straight alliance in their schools, 27% compared to 55% in suburban and 53% in urban schools. As I am Facebook and other sorts of corresponding friends with a number of young gay and trans people, all of whom are in university at this point, and in correspondence with younger people in schools in West Virginia, I'd also add the non-rocket science point that LGBTQ rural people can be very isolated. One young man's family found out he's gay and are now convinced through the intercession of their pastor that he is not. He has been enrolled in a religious school. They take his phone every night. They have removed him from contact from his former friends who were supportive of his gayness. And he is completely isolated and very worried about his future. And as one might imagine, he is extraordinarily depressed. Another is also isolated at home with parents intent on keeping him there so he won't fall in with gay and trans supportive people. And while these are only two anecdotal indications of the challenges faced by LGBTQ students, they do map onto the usual challenges of rural LGBTQ people, which is the lack of social support, isolation from a kind of face-to-face LGBTQ community, and I've had quite a few conversations with people who are now at WVU about how it's very different to be in day-to-day, face-to-face community than it is to be kind of hashing it out on Tumblr, although I think that is a very interesting thing to be able to do. And certainly pressure from religious conservatives to convert students back to heterosexuality or to push them to remain in their birth gender are a fairly common story that I hear when I travel around the state talking to people either at other universities or at public schools. And as I said, online resources help, but limitations on access to computers or smartphones continue to be a challenge for young people. The fact of same-sex marriage may also help. Studies before nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage show that gay and lesbian people had fewer emotional problems if they lived in states that allowed gay marriage. They might not have even, as young people, aspired to gay marriage. They just knew that there was a signal in the law that they could live to be adults. Mental health costs also declined for LGBTQ adults after Massachusetts legalized gay marriage. The simple point may be that laws teach the broader population and that young people notice these lessons. In West Virginia, where laws, policies, interpretations of policies, and so on are still in conflict and in flux, LGBTQ youth are not unreasonably uncertain of whether they fit, whether they have options, or whether they can expect to be recognized and respected by peers and adults, and whether they have any recourse at all if they're trapped at home. They don't feel like they can go into the system precisely for some of the reasons that our colleague suggested. Students hope that higher education offers them a way out, but they also fear expulsion from religious schools if they're found out to be gay, because that will mean they do not have a way to get into higher education. The flip side of all of this is that they are also very resilient. They're determined, and they need adults to become better advocates for them. More than a few of the young people who've contacted me or with whom I've had conversations do have wider networks of adult support, other parents, a caring teacher, or a strong family network. They know that things are better for LGBTQ people in other places. And even our LGBTQ Center's strongest donors are from out of state and have significantly bad memories of their time in West Virginia, but also remain committed to helping LGBTQ people who still live here. And they are especially concerned to help youth because they also experienced harassment, deep depression, suicide ideation. Not all of them. I don't want to tag every donor with that. But the fact is that they've been willing to share with people here that that was their experiences. So if laws or policies lag, we need to look at different kinds of justifications for educators and family members to think and act ethically towards LGBTQ youth. I've worked on a few papers with colleagues on this. I won't go into the long and gory details. It's really pretty simple. Some of this process requires becoming and staying educated about what terms mean, about what each of the acronyms mean. It may very well be that the T is the one that is going to change the most and the one that we need to know the most information about at this point. I run into a lot of people in schools who know nothing about this, and the remarkable inability of people to even do a simple Google search disturbs me to this day. We need to be thinking about the resources that youth need in terms of LGBTQ inclusive sex education, legal advocacy, and broader health and relationship issues. LGBTQ adults have long argued that the heterosexual dominant communities are sending us queer people who have no knowledge of their histories, no understanding of their responsibilities to one another in terms of protection from HIV and STIs and unwanted pregnancy, and insufficient understanding of consent and responsibilities to partners of whatever sort of duration. Further, young people come to our communities without understanding the diversities of people in them. They replicate the same racist, classist, sexist, and whatever else prevailing beliefs of their upbringing. They come to us bruised by homophobia and transphobia and hurt by isolation. And while we all have some degree of experience working through the same challenges, honestly, we prefer they grew up with rights, with respectful recognition, and in communities that valued them, laws or not.
Thank you, Cris. Next up, we have Matthew Sparks. I'm very excited to hear his talk. He is a queer Appalachian American freelance writer and editor and resident English language editor at the Center for Intercultural Dialogue and Translation in Cairo, Egypt. Please read his bio. It's fascinating. He is here today to share with us a talk about issues related to Appalachian identity and queer identity. Matthew.
Thank you. First of all, thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm thrilled that we're having this panel. Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you all of my co-panelists. So now we're going to switch it up a little bit and talk about some oral history. from Leslie County, Kentucky, which is southeastern Kentucky, if you know it, my hometown. So this all began in the summer of 2017 when I authored a piece for a two-part series in the Activist History Review centered around exploring the intersections of poverty, gender, sexuality, and whiteness in central Appalachia and the rural American South. The piece was titled The Unsettling of Appalachia, and it sparked several conversations among fellow Appalachians, writers, scholars, artists about the complex subject of identity in modern Appalachia. In this piece, I presented the thesis that in failing to develop a cohesive modern identity for ourselves as Appalachians on our own terms, in a Saidian Orientalist sense, our identity has continued to be defined for us by the hegemonic American cultural paradigm currently in power. Thus, Appalachia has been and continues to be a control group, or a barometer of sorts against which social progress in this country can be measured. This issue of identity is critical for contemporary Appalachians to address, as it leaves us as peripheral non-agents, unable to truly participate in the current cultural and political discourse in a real and meaningful sense. So, as a result of this, I began an Appalachian oral history project based out of my native Leslie County, in which I interviewed 8 self-identifying LGBTQ individuals, ages 24 to 45, between December 3rd, 2017 and January 10th, 2018. All interviews were conducted with the informed consent of the interviewees on a voluntary basis under the condition of anonymity. I'm excited to share some of the more pressing insights gained from this oral history project and hope that in doing so we can continue the conversation on Appalachian identity and the issues faced by LGBTQ plus Appalachians. When asked about what it means to identify as Appalachian, all interviewees expressed a great pride in their historical and cultural heritage, while acknowledging the shape-shifting nature of the region and the conflict between modernity and traditionalism that has shaped their identity formation as an Appalachian. One in particular acknowledged Appalachia's role as a mirror of the country, while another suggested that a focus on Appalachia's historic virtues of resilience, ingenuity, and self-reliance should serve as models for constructing a modern Appalachian identity. Following this note, when asked if they considered Appalachia to be a queer region, all also agreed that it is a region of unique queer interests that its culture need to be addressed in the culture. This is by virtue of its otherness from hegemonic American culture, its role as a mirror or a social barometer, and more recently, its status as a place of refuge for those seeking a more natural, communitarian, alternative mode of living from urban American life. I then asked interviewees to describe how they understand gender roles historically at present, and historically and at present as they operate in Appalachia. All also agree that gender roles have been historically rigid in the region, largely due to economic reasons, with men remaining the primary breadwinners and women supervising the care of the homes and children. Interestingly, 2 interviews in particular noted the matriarchal aspects of Appalachian family and clan groups, in which the strong mama figures tend to play incredibly powerful advisory roles. One in particular noted that this phenomenon is undergoing something of a revival with a renewed interest in the Appalachian granny witch role, and the lore, we've all got one, right? And the lore surrounding it. One also noted that due to an increased focus on education and economic necessity, female gender roles have rapidly changed in the region and will largely continue to do so, while male gender roles have remained static. When I began to delve into questions related to identifying as LGBTQ+ and Appalachian, the responses became much more varied and layered in complexity. While all interviewees expressed no issue with identifying as Appalachian and LGBTQ+ at the personal level, they each identified several cultural and political barriers that made it difficult for them to identify with broader Appalachian culture. 3 interviewees explained that this was particularly difficult when engaging in current political discourse, all articulating that they felt torn between supporting the political left due to their social progressivism and the political right due to their obligations to family and the local economy. Another argued that the political indifference on both sides of the political spectrum related to Appalachian issues in general has made them mostly politically apathetic. 2 interviews in particular noted that the overall queerness of the Appalachian region, in the above described sense, made it much easier to reconcile their own queerness with themselves. One, however, observed that Appalachia's stereotypical image as being backwards, ignorant, and bigoted made it difficult for themselves to identify as Appalachian. On the subject of larger challenges facing the Appalachian LGBT community, all interviewed parties expressed that familial acceptance, at least with their primary parents, guardians, caregivers, or partners, was not the most pressing issue within the Appalachian LGBTQ+ community as they understood it at present. In fact, several agreed that the overwhelming lack of community support and resources for LGBTQ+ Appalachians was the greatest threat to the flourishing of Appalachian communities in the region. Frustratingly, as one interview pointed out, the endurance of traditional male gender roles in the region has made it difficult, if not impossible, for LGBTQ plus male-identifying folks, in particular, to thrive in the area. In concluding the interviews, I asked participants to relay their thoughts on the future of LGBTQ plus culture in Appalachia in the light of other, potentially larger problems in the region that the region currently faces. Only 2 of 8 interviewees seemed optimistic that the region will continue to evolve in its acceptance of LGBTQ plus Appalachians as part of the broader Appalachian community. Although all agreed that solving the identity crisis facing Appalachians as a whole is a crucial step in increasing political participation in the region. One interview powerfully observed, and I'm quoting this verbatim, at present, there is little in the way of an authentically Appalachian identity, as it has largely been subsumed by a broader Southern identity. This identity, with its strong ties to the religious right, has come to dominate the cultural and political landscape of Appalachia. In this environment, LGBTQ plus Appalachians are largely ignored, as LGBTQ plus issues are considered to be the domain of the opposite political camp. This places pressure on young LGBTQ people to leave the area, contributing to the loss of intellectual and cultural resources that could help to address Appalachia's problems. I believe that if Appalachia is to be saved, then reconciliation with its LGBTQ plus population, among others, will be necessary. Though many are pessimistic that much needed changes in the area will actually occur, some interviewees drew attention to the fact that many artists and writers and scholars and academics in the area are beginning to incorporate reflections on Appalachian identity in their work, perhaps suggesting that as a culture we are beginning the discourse necessary to facilitate change. One interviewee emphasized the importance of volunteerism in the region as a means to consolidate disparate groups in Appalachia is another source for optimism, although it is clear that still much needs to change. Another interview in particular re-articulated that redefinition of traditional gender roles, particularly masculinity as it is seen in the region, is essential for fostering a community in which LGBTQ plus individuals can thrive. Although my study is not yet complete, this sampling of interviews with LGBTQ plus Appalachians serves as an enlightening reading of the current state of our community, in addition to identifying critical issues facing the Appalachian LGBTQ plus community, chiefly the lack of community support and resources. This study is a powerful illustration of the role that identity formation and consolidation plays and will continue to play in giving voice and agency to LGBTQ plus Appalachians and Appalachians writ large as we boldly move forward into our region's future. A lot to get through. Sorry.
Great. Next up we have Sam Leizear. Sam has been a member of the social work practice community since 1981 and until very recently was the field education director in the Department of Social Work here at WVU. And despite the fact that Sam has now returned to what he loves most, which is being a practicing social worker in the communities around here, he has continued to serve our students at WVU, and in fact, of his own volition, continues to supervise the social work students that work with our clinical law students in our clinical law program, which has had quite an impact here in West Virginia. So Sam, I thank you, and thanks for joining us today.
Happy to do it. And forgive me, I'm getting used to an hour and a half each way commute after 20 years of being able to kind of walk to my office. So I have a little commute lag. And I'm actually going to bring things into almost a more individual local level and a very specific aspect of people who are basically starting gender transition. There are multiple levels of transition and aspects, but I'm going to focus on the legal gender transition. If I focused on legal issues facing transgender people, we'd be here through the rest of the panel, 2 happy hours, dinner, and probably lunch. Okay? We'll have to wait for the movie. And here it is. What's in a legal name? Now, if you think about Appalachia, parts of 13 states, West Virginia, we're the whole shebang, 420 counties. And that's going to become important when we talk about some of these laws and state codes and county judges that impact folks when they are taking this step to change their legal identity documents so they can live authentically as who they are. Think about also just the extent of how our legal name and our legal, quote, sex or gender impacts our daily lives. Everybody here most likely has something on their person that has both their legal name and potentially their legal gender or sex on it. And when you change that, things really ramp up several notches. And when you're changing that because you are going through the gender affirmation process, it has a lot of moral baggage attached to it that other folks, judges and lawyers, a lot of times feel the need to attach. Okay, so what are sex and gender markers used for? Eligibility for services, health care, insurance rates. Anytime you fill out a new form for health insurance, car insurance, all those things, it asks a lot of those questions. Inclusion and particularly exclusion in establishments, clubs, sports teams, and so forth. Now there have been some changes in that. I've done a lot of work with the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, particularly working with their domestic violence shelters to be more welcoming to transgender women victims. And when you think about all of those, there are a lot of sex segregated establishments in our world, even though we're starting to change that a little bit. Sexist jokes, prejudice, and discrimination. If you want to have a painful lesson on how alive and horribly unwell sexism is, come to one of my support group meetings and hear the stories of those trans women. The legal criteria of sex and gender. Who makes the decision and based on what? If you do any research on intersex conditions, which is any type of variation on the 5 or 6 biological criteria that make us who we are, or sometimes who we aren't, the frequency of that, there are, the last stats I saw, 1 in 100 infants have some variation on a theme. Now it can be as minor or limited that, you know, it may be just how they produce hormones, that kind of stuff, or it can be as major as a child is born with ambiguous genitalia and you can't tell. What I'm trying to get at is very few of us are 100% anything. But when we start looking at these legal criteria, it is very black and white, male, female, nothing in between. Is it what we see, what we don't see, a little bit of both? One of the guest lectures I do is called What You See Is Not Always What You Get, and all of those kinds of things. Is it based on secondary sex characteristics? Who knows? And when I have talked to people about laws, you get a mixed bag of what they think it means. And when you have a person standing in a courtroom in Preston County, West Virginia, and here is the person who is going to make the decision as to, one, whether they can have their name legally changed to fit their identity, or two, have their gender marker changed so they can get a new birth certificate, or in some states get a brand new license so they don't drive around in fear of being pulled over and having the wrong information on their license, or even voting with a photo ID. It makes a big difference. And all of you in this room have the capacity to make a huge difference in someone's lives when they're doing something as simple as a legal name change. Look at all of these areas that focus on gender or sex. Birth certificate, all of those things. Now, the marriage piece has changed a bit with marriage equality, but I'm going to tell you an anecdotal story that will show you how it can also still be utilized to throw a wrench in the machinery. And again, down here, the segregated school services, domestic violence, shelters, prisons, locker rooms, bathrooms. I believe there are a lot more gender-neutral bathrooms on this campus than there were in 2004. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you in 2004, there were 3 in this whole campus. And I know we're on tape, but I'm going to take a risk here. And I was informed that I would be arrested if I was caught using the men's room because I was changing my gender, finally. And there were 3 places I could go. Talk about performance anxiety. Just saying. That's right. But that's how basic we'll get. And you know, that criteria that we hear in all the bathroom bills is based on what you got, or what you don't got, so to speak. I know that's horrible grammar, I apologize, but that's basically what it boils down to. In our 13 states in Appalachia, every state has some kind of different criteria. Some require surgery, some do a court order process, for birth certificates, and I did the research about what each state requires. After all the stuff down in North Carolina, I was surprised that North Carolina gives a brand new birth certificate. The amended certificates, West Virginia, and here's a little anecdotal story about West Virginia. West Virginia used to provide a brand new birth certificate to folks when they provided a letter from a surgeon. However, back in 2006, I believe, before marriage equality, one of our esteemed legislators came up with an idea, and that got a lot of encouragement from his colleagues, that the way people were going to get around this same-sex marriage ban was one of them was going to go through the sex change process, and then they were going to get married legally, and they were going to get away. And they bought that, and they changed the code under the radar. So now there's a birth certificate. You get an amended birth certificate, and I've often said, and I would not be surprised if it was the original one was crossed out with a pencil marked in. And I'm being sarcastic, but again, that's what we're talking about. 2 states refuse to even do any modification. And these states vary. You get a new birth certificate, but it has an addendum to it. How you all can help. And we were just talking about this earlier. Assist with the forms. Recommend a fee waiver. Here in this state, it's $200 cash. Most trans folks pay for almost every part of their transition out of pocket. So fee waivers are important. Do an identity document clinic. Advocate, and I've tried this here and I've not gotten very far, for a waiver of publication. A legal name change goes in the local paper. That is a safety and privacy issue for trans people living in rural America. There was a precedent set in New York, but again, it was for one person and one person only. Go stand with the person. I've been in several courtrooms in this state, and as long as I'm dressed decently and not real sarcastic, it's helped a lot. I've been with parents and kids. I've been with a 65-year-old. So even though the person meets all the legal criteria for a name change, a lot of times judges will throw some moral stuff, say, I don't believe in this, it doesn't exist, therefore I'm not going to do it. Educate your judges. I believe that some of this comes from just not understanding the depth and breadth of what people go through when they opt to do gender affirmation. On a bigger level, advocate for removal of surgery requirements, the waiver of court orders, advocate for non-binary choices. One state in our country, Oregon, has a third category. The state of Germany, the country of Germany has a third gender. Advocate for the removal of, or at least the flexibility of, gender markers for determination. Educate yourself. Community policymakers, organize. Come on, folks. We're all about social justice and advocacy and all those things. Push it. You have the capability and the backing and the chutzpah to do it. Do your homework. Get on a feed so you can hear what's going on. All of these kinds of things. And here are some resources. These folks are great, and they update their resources as often as they can, but we really don't have any one particular place in West Virginia to do that. Something as simple as your name and your gender / sex on a document is really important. And that's all I have, but thank you.
last but certainly not least, we have Professor Cris here. She is a professor in the School of Social Work here at WVU. She's also the director of the Gerontology Certificate Program, and she's going to talk to us about the older population of rural Appalachian LGBTQ plus folk.
And I have a minute, right?
30 seconds for you. This is all planned out, Cris.
That's okay.
She's also a fantastic teacher who won the faculty award at the university last year. You know I'm going to say that.
So I know I was the last presenter in the last session before happy hour, which I'm not sure I can attend because I don't think I'm old enough to consume. And so this morning, I just revamped everything. So I thought, yeah, I'm the last presenter on Friday. And, so we all like stories, right? Yeah. So I decided to kind of go the story route. But in general, what I'm going to talk about is kind of an intersection of all the things I'm interested in personally and professionally and research-wise, which are older adults, LGBTQ people, and rural and Appalachian populations. So intersect. Try to keep up, all right? I had students that made one of these, and I thought, I'm going to make one of these someday. So we got a PAL tune. Maybe let's see, I think the volume's on.
Yes.
We'll give it a try.
Yeah.
Maybe I can even get it expanded. And that's what's playing the guitar, too.
Stop bragging.
I didn't go for the expensive version, so there's two of the same character, one's meditating. Okay, so in terms of research and such about this population specifically, there really isn't anything. So we're going to kind of piece some things together here. But what we do know, we know some things about LGBTQ older adults, which kind of feel kind of funny saying Q because it's not usually something. The Q is usually not identified by the older population. So, but I'll include it anyway. So. And what we do know about the older LGBT population is that they have a lot of the same challenges that other non-LGBTQ older adults have, like chronic health conditions, limited income, and ageism. So from the case we just looked at, well, we saw the two gentlemen had some health conditions, not super severe. We're not sure if they've experienced some ageism. They don't seem to be having any limited finances. But one thing they probably have experienced, which a lot of older LGBT folks do, are lifelong, and I'm going to stress that, lifelong stigma and discrimination. And you also have to kind of think of these folks as, in cohorts. And so, now we have marriage equality for the past couple of years, right? But think about those folks that are, 90 years old, 80 years old, 70 years old, 60 years old, that lived through some times that really were not very supportive of their identities and lifestyles and relationship. And, their identity was considered to be part of a mental illness. They were arrested for different kinds of sexual conduct. So you really kind of have to put that in perspective, although we're at a place in history where we've had a lot of, what seems like really quick progressions really weren't, but all of a sudden we're kind of seeing some policy changes, that these folks have lived through some times that, really weren't very supportive of their identities and relationships, and oftentimes involved violence as well. These folks were victims of violence. So, and by the way, marriage equality in this country was won by an older lesbian. I don't know if y'all know that. My biggest regret in life is that before all that, I met her at a conference, and we were invited to stay at her apartment in Greenwich Village or someplace. And I said, no, I think we'll stay at the hotel. Yeah. No, we're not going to stay with Edie Windsor. No. Don't know her. Not going to stay over there. Yeah. But a lot of these folks have a fear, and a lot in interviews that I've conducted, they'll actually use that term, fear of professionals and even in like the business communities that are not going to be supportive or sensitive to their unique needs and situations. And so they really kind of need to be networked to these individuals because they've had bad experiences, and we can kind of see why they would be a little fearful. So if we kind of drill down then to looking at rural, and I'll say rural like / Appalachian, because we really don't know much about the older LGBTQ Appalachian population. We do know some things about the rural population. Is that group is more isolated than folks that don't live in rural Appalachian areas, and a lot of people describe it as kind of living in a fishbowl anyway, living in a small community. So they're far more isolated and feel like they're kind of being maybe watched a little more. So if you think about Richard and Jerry moving, and we kind of call that return migrants, which a lot of people do because they might have, earlier on in life moved to a bigger area for jobs or to kind of come out and find community, but then kind of return migrate back to the town they grew up in, either because they have a house to live in, that someone passed and they have a house to live in, or they just want kind of a more affordable, kind of laid back lifestyle, or they have grandchildren that they want to help out with. So it's not an uncommon experience to kind of do that. And some of these folks, although Richard and Jerry seem to be out with their family and a few friends, they're a little more reserved with other people, Richard's high school friends and that type of thing. And they might, if they decide not to commute for healthcare services and church services and that kind of stuff, they might be more apprehensive and fearful about being connected to supportive and sensitive professionals and other persons in the community. So these areas, sometimes you have a situation where you have LGBTQ people who, they kind of go by that don't ask, don't tell policy. And, a lot of them you'll find that kind of follow that practice get along pretty well within their families and communities, because as long as it's not out there, it's fine. And that actually kind of ties into kind of a culture, Appalachian culture, that promotes minding your own business. So, it kind of goes pretty well with that. Although these areas also are far more conservative religiously and prescribe to pretty traditional family values and gender roles. So I talked about the challenges facing this group, but they also have a lot of strengths. If you have older folks who have been discriminated against for a long period of time, they build resilience. And all older people do. Have you ever met a 90-year-old? Those are LGBTQ or not, don't mess with them. Don't, because they have a lifetime of resilience. But if you add in there people who have experienced discrimination, maybe have had family members ostracize them, then they're pretty resilient. And they say that they're better able to deal with kind of the bumps of old age, too, from that. So, you know, they also can form some very tight, highly supportive networks could be lifelong, too. People that support them could be friends, could also be family members that are supportive. And that actually also fits in really well with Appalachian culture, with the very, very strong family and friendship and social ties. So even if they're out and they do the don't ask, don't tell policy, they could have family and friends that are very accepting, as long as it's not spoken. So I want to end on a good note, okay? Also, I've talked about some of the strengths here, but, you know, the times are changing. And then we kind of move back a little bit. But, you know, overall, I think things are progressing. And we have more interest in research outlets and funded research on LGBTQ older adults and other populations than we've ever seen. Public opinion polls are more favorable toward this population. We're having more supportive public policies, if they stay in place, hopefully, right? And lastly, we have a forum like this where we have professionals that truly care about the well-being of this population and the future, and making it better for people that in the Appalachian communities that are aging as LGBTQs. So I did go over.
Yeah, I told you. We do have time for a question or two, and in order to encourage you to actually take advantage of this amazing panel, no one's getting any alcohol until 5:50. I've laid down the law out there, okay? So rushing out there, if you want to be first in line, that's your priority.
You know what, I got some back here.
So don't try it, students or anybody else. Does anyone like to ask a question? Barbara.
This is for Mr. Williams and Todd, right? I just had a question about your data about depression, because I think it was that the depression rates are higher than for non-LGBT, but
Right.
we can disaggregate the LGBT and then the T, isn't that like particularly
Yes,
high?
that's,
Okay.
we can't in this data, the Gallup data, but in other situations that has been done, and yes, the trans individuals, depression rates in trans individuals are off the charts. And so I would guess, right, since it's higher here in Appalachia, that would be also true for the trans community here in Appalachia.
Sam, do you have any data on that? Sam, do you have any data on that, or?
Just that I know for trans folks, it's 41% have attempted
Have attempted suicide.
suicide.
So,
And that is like
That's an extraordinary number.
multiple times than the non-trans. And the thing is too, that we have, because we have a higher, to go along with Dr. Hash's comments, we're an older state. I think, are we still tied for first with Florida?
Second.
Or we're second? Okay.
Pennsylvania.
And so then that stands to reason. I've done some things particularly on older trans adults, and we see there's more of an incidence of what we call, it's not regret, but it's detransitioning, particularly when they have to move out of their homes. They are so concerned about being treated poorly, and I'm not just saying being inappropriate comments or refused treatment, but assault in a long-term care facility or something like that, that they go back. And it's a very sad reflection on things.
Lynn, I know I saw your hand up, Lynn.
I'm sorry.
No, I just want to make a comment that, Sam,
Yes.
in Texas, we can change the birth certificates. I've done, when I was in private practice, I changed a lot of same-sex couples' names to
Wonderful.
matchy, and the kids to matchy. I even got to invent a name. It was really cool.
Nice. In Texas.
And so, I mean, when you change a birth certificate, yeah, some of the judges are like, it's not what I really believe, but I'm gonna do it. And I was like, yes. So, Texas, although people are like, Texas, it really is very, it's a lot more progressive than you think. But I know I'm not part of that. Appalachia.
There are pockets of what I call pockets of progressivity in our state. The Domestic Violence Coalition has always had a very strong outreach and advocacy for the LGBTQ population. And even when certain conservative donors said, if you don't stop working with those people, we're taking our money, and they said, you can have your money if it comes with those conditions. So they have been amazing, and even requiring all of their shelters and programs to get the training about, hey, let's turn all victims into survivors. So, and that's some of the neatest part. And the Appalachian part, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell stuff actually worked very well for my spouse and I when we lived in Preston County. Many people were like, we like you, you work hard, we're not worried about it, we love the person you are, don't worry about it. Whereas people that you might presume would be a little cooler, we're not. So you can never assume. But there are some that Don't Ask, Don't Tell sometimes it's a survival, helps people survive.
It's kind of part of the culture here too. It's kind of like, do what you want to do on your own property, just don't come do it on mine.
Yeah, or I'm not going to walk in a pride parade with you, but I will. I mean, I know one person said, we know that we can call you at 2 a.m. if we have an emergency, and you can call us. It doesn't matter. So it's, there's some good stuff out there too, but we also need to make some major changes.
Is anyone besides Georgie? Wonderful.
Mr. Brower, is it correct that
Todd,
you said...
please.
Is it correct that you said that people of color tend to come out more as part of the LGBT community?
The opposite. LGBT people here in Appalachia, there's a higher percentage of people of color than the other non-LGBT population.
Okay, and why is that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Although it's the sort of assumption is that LGBT people are white, and we get that from all the media stuff. The truth is that's not actually true at all. And child LGBT people raising kids there's a large percentage of people of color raising kids tend to be lesbians, but lesbians of color tend to raise children. In part, it relates to what we were talking about. Oftentimes, these are women who had a past heterosexual relationship and then take that child with them when they come out later. So some of these trends that are true here in Appalachia are also true nationally.
We're also seeing a rising number of grandparents raising grandchildren,
Yes.
especially because we're very much a kinship care culture here, so you could potentially see some of the LGBT older folks taking care of grandchildren.
Professor Beatty.
Would be her, wouldn't it?
Thank you very much for all of your contributions today. I've learned a lot. So given everything we've discussed, can we in good conscience encourage LGBTQ youth to stay here and to stay in Appalachia?
Professor Mayo.
It's not good to ask me because I'm not from here, but I am working with some very lovely students who are involved in a number of projects, including one whose acronym is STAY, that are really trying to change the culture. And I think there's a lovely group in southern West Virginia called Queer Appalachia that does a lot of mutual aid, that raises money and does these wonderful community projects. So I think, on the one hand, I would say there is no north. So migrating is not going to work out well. There's plenty of hate crime in any city. There are huge populations of, within homeless youth populations, the proportion of LGBT youth in urban centers is from 40 to 60%. Things are not rosy anywhere. And so staying in places where there are kinship networks, where there are people who are creating alternative community structures, I think is a good thing to do. But don't ask an adult who has mobility and who has capital to move, was this a good idea? Because that adult would say, no, this was a mistake. In a time where the trend has been to get a little conservative, the fact that we're in a place that is going this camera's on, that thing that bats do, insanity direction, is problematic. And so, you know, when youth, I think, want to go to somewhere where they have more recourse, I tend to be supportive, but I also want them to come here. I want them to come to WVU because I think this is a community that is supportive. We have the ordinance in place. We have a very supportive administration. We have a support structure now with an LGBTQ center and also with a very good counseling center here that is very well trained on LGBTQ related issues should people come with depression or even with suicide ideation. So I would say there are places, but I would also say, having talked, and I'm sorry to go on at length, but having talked to people who are very isolated and who are on the razor edge of despair, I just want them to go somewhere where they're not going to hurt themselves. And I have never worked in a job where I have felt that before.
Yeah.
And this
Isolation is
overwhelming.
deadly.
Yeah.
It's deadly, and even in the support group, we have people that come from 2.5 hours, because there are only 2 support groups, one's in the southern part of the state and one's here. And they talk about just being able to sit in a room with other people like me. And the technology's wonderful, don't get me wrong, but it's still just sitting there and even being able to go, you do exist and I do exist, and we're gonna get through this. And so that piece of cutting down the isolation and just putting
And
the
I think
hand
that
out.
complication you were talking about in terms of having to go into supportive care that is outside of a family, that's frightening.
It's very scary.
Last question, Professor LaFaso.
I wrote a paper for this symposium on called De-Essentializing Appalachia, and I found, Professor Brower, I found the work that the Williams Institute did and saying that, what was it, there was greater, was it transgender or was LGBT, was the highest in West Virginia? It was one of the
Transgender youth, right?
Right. And right now it's still in the paper, but I really, when I thought, has there been, so I have like a twofold question. One is just a tiny question is that historical? Like, has that been, like, do you have many years of that? And I'm just wondering if that's a blip or something. And then my second question is then, more broadly, is the reason we wrote this article is because one of the things I noticed is living here in West Virginia for 11 and a half years, but I'm from originally Long Island, is everyone's calling this Trump country. Well, on Facebook, my friends from Long Island are much more Trumpeters than here. And so I started realizing there was all this essentialization of what Appalachia is. It's all white, it's all, so we undo this, then that's why we uncovered this. So if anyone wants to speak to whether they think, what they think of that, and whether they think some of that there's really the rurality, because many of you were talking about rurality, really is less of a distinction than normal. Because what most of you have been saying is that rurality makes a difference, but is there some ways where it doesn't make a difference at all? If that makes sense? Okay.
So let me answer the short one.
Yes.
To my knowledge, that's the only study, the one that you read, so
Right.
I have no idea whether it's a blip or whether it's consistent.
Right.
Can you say a tiny bit about the methodology? Because I read it and I'm still kind of interested.
I didn't do it, so
Okay.
I'd have to refresh
Okay.
my recollection. But let me say this, by the way. I am happy to have people email me, and I will do 2 things. I'll respond to questions, or we'll send you off to the person at the Williams Institute who actually did the stuff. But also, this material that I presented will eventually be a formal paper after it goes through our review process. The data is final, but I'm not allowed to give anybody this data other than orally. But I'll be happy to send you the final paper if anybody is at all interested in that stuff. Sorry.
You know, happy hour is.
I'm going with drinks
technical.
up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fun.
Hopefully.
Thanks so much.
Can you teach me how to do that? Thank you.
My parents?
Yeah. I do oral history work, and I'm doing a project right now.
I'm glad you brought her. I usually have